Hi, welcome to Extra Connections. I'm James Lott Jr. here of JLJ Media. I'm actually a JLJ of JLJ Media. And welcome to another episode of our long-running show, Extra Connections. I think we're on 6 years. I can't remember, seven, but we're getting there. And I want to thank you because I like bringing you people, places, things, ideas. Today, it's a person. He's not a thing. He's a person. And we're going to talk to him and find out what he's about because I'm going to get this correctly. He is a forensic psychiatrist. You're like, what does that mean? You hear forensic, you got an idea. You hear psychiatrist, we're gonna find out what that means together. He's a consultant for many TV and podcast programs. He's the author of the best-selling book, In Two Minds, Stories of Murder, Justice, Recovery from a Forensic Psychiatrist. He is from the UK, because you know I'm an Anglophile. Dr. Sohom Das. Hi, Dr. Das.
Hello, sir. Thank you for such a great intro. How you doing?
I'll follow you around, just introduce you everywhere. That's what we'll just do from now on. I love all things Britain, so I'm a huge fan. And I just found out from my DNA that I'm mostly Scottish, apparently.
Really?
Like
You do?
20%. Like 20%.
Okay. I used to live in Scotland for a short period of time, and you don't seem Scottish, sir.
Yeah, I don't think I am either, but I got it done, and that's what they said. I'm like, okay, sure, I'll take it. I've never been there, so that's fine. But welcome to the show, of course, and
Thank you.
we just go right into what is because we hear forensic. And the only
Yeah.
reason why we know the word forensic in America is because of CSIs and Bones and shows like that. I mean, I heard it before, but now it's something that a lot of people I know are going into as forensic science and all that kind of stuff. So, what is a
Yeah.
forensic psychiatrist?
Yep. Ultimate question. So, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who specializes in mental illness, right? Some people mistake or conflate psychologists and psychiatrists. Psychologists are not doctors first, psychiatrists are. And a forensic psychiatrist, such as myself, is somebody who does that, but specifically for people that commit violence. So there are lots of different types. There are some that work in prisons, which I used to do. Some who work in like secure units. Broadmoor, have you heard of Broadmoor? It's
Yes.
infamous in our country. I'm not sure if its reputation has made it across the pond. Or they can be expert witnesses. So that's what I do right now. So I'm the guy that gives evidence in court, and specifically whether an individual has a mental illness when they've committed a crime, usually violence or a sexual crime. And if they did have a mental illness, did they have symptoms at that moment in time? Yes or no? That's what the judge wants from me. And if they did have symptoms, are they criminally responsible? So ultimately, should they go to prison, which happens for the vast majority of people I assess, or are they one of the small group that need to be sectioned under like a criminal section of the Mental Health Act to go to a locked, secure unit for long-term rehabilitation? So that, in a nutshell, is what a forensic psychiatrist is.
So it's a lot to unpack there because I'm like a lot of us like, okay, so you're dealing with violent, sometimes, well, let me say, sometimes violent individuals, deeply disturbed individuals. So, how does your like literally? How do you do it? Like, I try to sound like really professional. Like, no, let's just break it down to brass tacks. Like, how
Yeah.
you have to have a certain temperament, obviously, but how do you like have the strength to go into these prisons or go into these things and talk to these people who are potentially dangerous?
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose there's a couple of things I'd say to that. Firstly, I am very aware of my role, right? So I am not there to judge the individual, even though sometimes they have done horrific things. So I've seen people that have killed children. I've seen people that have abused children, that have killed random strangers. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes because they're suffering from acute mental illness, so they literally don't know what they're doing. And I separate the act from the person. So I'm not there to decide if they're good or evil, whether they're guilty or innocent. I'm only there to decide what their psychiatric state is and whether that affects their actions at the time. So because I'm clearing that in my mind, it's easier for me to kind of be a bit more emotionally detached. That's one thing. The other thing, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, James, I think that I am naturally a little bit detached anyway. So I think I'm a tiny bit of a psychopath, like a 5% psychopath. But I haven't killed anybody or anything like that. But I think that it would be easy for me to say that because I've worked in doing this for so long, and I have been doing it for almost a decade now, that I've become detached. But the honest truth is, I think I was always like that. I just happened by luck to have got into a profession where that helps rather than the other way around. And I suppose the other thing is that I'm just so busy all the time that I don't really have time to pontificate or ruminate over the horrid things that I see. So as well as my work being extremely busy, as you know, I'm breaking into the media or trying to got my own YouTube channel, got a family, try and exercise every day. So I don't have any space in my life to sit and ruminate over the kind of extreme violence.
Okay, so on a smaller level, a different level, I used to be a nurse. I was a geriatric nurse for about 11 years, and my folks didn't know that. And you're right. On some level, you have to be able, going into professions like this, to be a little detached, because we have to say things very plainly. Sometimes I was explaining to someone the other day, when someone passes, you can't say to someone in the hospital, "They pass." They teach us to say they died. It sounds almost harsh for some people. Like, oh no, you understand the psychology. I've explained to you, the psychology of people. They passed where? Like down the street? Like their brains might will not get it, or they went away. They're away. No, you don't. You can't be. You have to actually say they died on the table, or they died, or we were taught that. And so I think I'm able to compartmentalize some things too. So I think that's what helped me become a nurse, and now kind of doing journalist stuff and things, and like talking to people and doing interviews. I can sit over here and write and not judge. But I'm just fascinated for you, because I'm not interviewing or talking to murderers and heinous crime people. That but I guess you just answered my question. So you don't take it home. I mean, literally, because you're just kind of doing it. You're not taking it home with you and like drinking heavily every night. Like you just somehow you're okay, right?
Yeah, and I suppose this is going to make my job sound a bit more boring than it really is, and it's not a kind of sensationalist or a sexy thing to say, but the truth is that when I'm assessing these individuals, it's not like you see on TV. It's not really that exciting, to be honest with you. So usually there's quite a big gap between when they've committed their act and me assessing them. So they're usually on remand. Say something like murder, I might see them typically 6 months after it's happened, number one. And number two, generally they're on their best behavior when they're speaking to me, because they know that I'm going to write a report that the judge is going to see. So it's not in their interest to try and do the Dr. Hannibal Lecter and try and freak me out. If anything, they're the opposite. They're overly kind of polite. So I'm not saying that I don't see some stuff, because I do, but it's not quite as dramatic as one might assume.
Well, I guess it's very clinical. I mean, it's like you're trying to assess somebody, so you have to catch everything. I'm sure lots of notes. I'm sure it's all kind of stuff. Yeah, I can see that. But still, like a professor. Okay, so if you can share one, what is one of the most unusual cases? I mean, you've had a lot over the last decade, but what is just one of the unusual cases you've had that you can speak about a little bit?
Happy to, yeah. So I talk about quite a few cases in my book, and I always anonymize them because I think it's a bit disrespectful to identify them as individuals. So I'm going to tell you about this patient who I've called Yasmin, and that's not her real name. So she sticks out in my mind, and I think she always will. It's such an emotional case because she was 18 years old. She had no history of any antisocial behavior, no previous mental health problems. She was a model student. She'd applied to medical school, and she became psychotic. She had an illness, schizoaffective disorder, I believe, which came on relatively quickly with very little warning, which is unusual. Usually it grumbles on for months and months. And she basically babysat and killed her 2-year-old nephew. So he was just about to turn 3. She believed at the time that he had demons inside of him. So she had these delusional, paranoid beliefs. And she also had these grandiose beliefs about being able to reincarnate him. And so she smothered him with a pillow. She didn't try and hide it in any way. Her mother, because she lived at home with her parents and her brother, who's the father of the child. If anything, she was confused why people were questioning her, why the police didn't believe her, because in her head, she hadn't done anything wrong. And then she was remanded to prison, a infamous prison called Holloway in London, which is now shut. But when I saw her, which would have been, I think, in 2015 or 16, it was back then. And it was really hard to assess her because she was very evasive and paranoid and closed because of her delusional beliefs. And upon my evidence, she was almost going to have a life sentence and to go to prison for life, which I think it was the wrong thing to do because she was mentally ill. So upon my evidence, she got transferred to a medium secure unit and stayed there for many years and had a long-term rehabilitation with medication, with psychotherapy. And what's so emotional and tragic about this case, apart from obviously what she did, is that it took about 18 months of us medicating her before her delusional beliefs actually assuaged. So for that entire time, she didn't believe that she'd killed a nephew, like people were telling her, but she didn't believe it. It took that long for the beliefs to go and for the psychosis to be cured. And then, as you'd expect, this sort of torrent of depression and guilt and shame came across her, and we had to treat that. So we had to give her therapy to do that. And finally, the other thing that I really remember that pulls on my heartstrings is that I was part of the family therapy. So every week, her brother, who was the father of the child, would sit in a room with her and the three of us, and sometimes a separate psychologist would kind of just try and mend that relationship, I guess, over the space of many months. So yeah, that will always I'll always have that seared onto my brain, those experiences
with the family. Oh my god, I don't know how you did that. That's ugh, yeah. I know so when you went to school and stuff, you learned that our brain is very complex, isn't it? It's very
yeah
complex. I'm
yeah
noticing I had severe Bell's palsy a few years ago. So my nerve behind, so folks will notice my nerve behind my ear got inflamed. Half my face I was paralyzed. And yeah, I was a nurse and I know how the body works, but for some reason, like it really hit home how everything's connected. Number one, but also the
yeah
brain. The brain is, I mean, there's so many different parts to it, and what it can do, what it can't do, and what's affected by nature, what's affected by nurture, what's affected by like. I mean, so I guess that's one of the things you really learned going to school and stuff was how the brain is very vast, isn't it?
yeah absolutely. And nature and nurture is one of the key kind of elements, I guess, in when I'm doing my reports. Like the court wants to know from the expert witness why the person ended up doing these things, right? And I mean, everybody accepts, I think, now that it's both nature and nurture. But the thing that I can assess the most, the thing that I'm the most interested in, is nurture. So the environment that an individual is brought up in. And I have to say, Yasmin is exceptionally rare because she had nothing in her background that would be a risk factor for future violence. But she's one of maybe 2% of cases like that in my entire career. Almost everybody else has something in their background, whether it's poverty, being the victims of physical or sexual abuse themselves, neglectful parents, severe bullying at school. Drug and alcohol use is huge in the patient cohort that I see. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is it's quite an uncomfortable truth that the people that you read about and the people that I assess who've done horrible things, unspeakable things, almost all of them were victims themselves in one way.
Well, in America right now, it's a big debate because we have a lot of school shootings happening here.
Yeah.
A lot of shootings, period. But and they're trying to figure out what is it this nature. I mean, do you have any thoughts, Eddie? Look, I mean, we're going to do a little hot takes later, but I'm just kind of curious. What are your thoughts about? Because I think aren't we the country with the most? I mean, it happens. We almost have one every day now at this point.
Yeah, it is absolutely.
And they're
It's
trying to
absolutely
figure out
insane, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, obviously, gun laws completely polarize the average American, don't they? And they don't like American generals don't like people, especially foreigners, kind of criticizing them. But it's hard to really see what other factor there is because I think, well, I don't think it's just the access to guns. I think it's also the culture.
They're bringing up mental health a lot. The other side.
Yeah. And I suppose it's with the mental health thing, it's really difficult because it's a fine line between just tarring everybody with the same brush and say anybody that's committed a school massacre must have mental health problems by definition. I think it's easy to say that, but I don't think it's particularly helpful because I think that sometimes it's not about mental health issues. I'll rephrase that. It's not about a mental illness that stops them knowing what they're doing. It's about the context of their environment. So if they're relentlessly bullied, if they had some of the things I was saying before, if they don't feel supported or they feel isolated or marginalized because of the way they're brought up, their relationships with their parents, and you throw in access to guns on top of that, and you got kind of a culture where some young teens idolize killers. It's seen as like, emo, cool, rebellious. You throw all of those things in combination. So I think that underpins most of these school shootings. I think it's dangerous to call them mentally ill because for the very rare cases where it is driven by mental illness, those people are a different category that can be rehabilitated, for example. And I think it also adds to the stigma of mental illness for people that have things like schizophrenia, which obviously we know the vast majority of people like that are not violent.
That's always brought by the other folks saying chances are the victims of violence are usually people who are mentally ill, not the ones. So I know something. I'm just a little light curious what you thought because that's something you do. Has there ever been a case where you're like, nah, can't do it? You're just like, nope, this is too much. I just can't do it.
No, I've never thought that because my role isn't to decide whether I like an individual, or if I'm being a professional, it shouldn't be whether I can handle the depravity of what they've done. It should be to give a psychiatric opinion. So if I'm saying that I can't do that, then in my mind, it has to be because I'm saying I'm not clinically competent, not because I can't take the personality or the level or the degree of violence. And I just think that's unprofessional. I think I put myself out as an expert witness, so I should be ready to deal with any case. I suppose it's kind of like the equivalent of having a murder detective, right? Saying, no, I don't want to solve this case because it's too horrific. Like, that's not helpful. That's not, you've taken on a responsibility. I have definitely met defendants that so in clinical terms, I would say would be sort of, hostile, passive aggressive, antisocial personality disorder. But in my head, I'd be probably thinking this guy's a complete dick. I really don't like him. But you can still do your job properly if you don't like somebody. It's not about whether I like them or not. Yeah. So there are some people who I've met who don't show any kind of remorse, they're generally not violent towards me. I have had my moments, definitely. I've been punched in the face twice in my career.
Really?
But yeah. But generally speaking, they're not violent because it doesn't help their cause. They're probably going to get in, more trouble. But I've definitely had people who are just horrible, really narcissistic, and very intentionally kind of argumentative. So I get the minimum amount that I need for the psychiatric assessment, rely on all the other evidence that I've got about making a diagnosis, but I don't get drawn into arguments. And I think some people just want an argument, and there's no point because I'm not going to get a psychiatric diagnosis by arguing with somebody. So, I kind of pull back a little bit, and I sort of shut down that kind of level of aggression or conversation.
But I also wonder on the flip side, has anybody super impressed you, so to speak? You're like, wow, this person, because you're a psychiatrist, so you know all the tricks I'm sure that people will try on you or whatever. But like, have you ever been really impressed by anybody? I mean, I know you're not judging, but I'm just curious, like anybody really gets you like, wow, okay, that's something else.
No, I think because of the context that I work in, so I exclusively see people who have committed fairly serious
Yeah.
crimes, uh, or I do civil court cases as well. So people that have been victims
Oh,
of quite horrific kind of abuse. So I wouldn't say that anybody's impressed me. But I think if I was working as a psychiatrist in another field and saw generalized patients, then I'm absolutely sure that would happen. So yeah, I'm afraid not. No.
very good. I'll ask you all the questions everybody's going to ask me. They would ask me, these are the questions the fans want to know. All right, awesome. So let's go back a little bit because now let's go back to like who are you and why are you doing this? So number one, what kind of child were you? What was your personality like? Were you the gregarious child? Were you like strong? Like what kind of child were you?
What kind of child was I? Okay. I think I was fairly confident and fairly fearless when I was younger. I had a strange upbringing, I think is fair to say. So a couple of things. Firstly, my family moved when I was about 7 to a small white village in a place called Cheshire, and we were literally the only non-white family in the entire village. I was the only brown kid in my entire school,
Wow.
and I think that affected me, if I'm being honest.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back at it now, I don't think it was as bad as I remember it being. Like I got bullied a little bit, but it wasn't a lot, and I kind of gave back as much as I got. But at that time, I felt very, very self-conscious throughout pretty much
Sure.
most of my formative years. That's one thing. The other thing that I think is different or atypical about my childhood was that my dad especially, used to make me study all the time. In his head, he was setting me up to have a bright future, which kind of worked out to a degree. But I remember resenting it, to be honest with you, quite a bit when I was younger, because I didn't feel that I was be able to do the things that my other peers could do. I wasn't allowed to go out and play anywhere near as much as the other kids in my neighborhood. So I remember being quite angry about that, and I remember being, as I say, a bit resentful, and I remember being a bit lonely, if I'm being honest. Like, it was hard for me to make friends with people because I'm completely different to everyone else by the way I look, and because I wasn't allowed out of the house anywhere near as much. I kind of made up for it towards my later teenage years through my personality, but definitely there's a difficult period of time in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, no. Seriously, as we are in America, we're celebrating Juneteenth as we're recording this, which is when a proclamation of the slaves are out there and stuff. And I know a lot of folks who started to migrate, move around. Where I've been in situations where I was the only black, brown person in the situation, it does affect you a little bit. It does. It's kind of it just in a way, it affects you in ways sometimes you don't even realize. It's kind of like, but also it makes you stronger too at the same time because you have to really stand for yourself, so to speak.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
do.
yeah, absolutely. I think it can either make or break you depending on your personality. If you're naturally introverted, which I wasn't, then it's going to push you further away from trying to mingle with people. My sister was a bit like that. So she's 10 years older than me, but went through the same kind of experiences. But if you have that sort of spark in you, then yeah, it helps you develop it, I guess. But I suppose the other things also depends on your age, right? Like I think teenagers, adolescents, early adults, they understand that they've got the power to change the dynamics. But when you're pretty young, when you're 10, 11, 12, you don't understand what any of that means, I think.
So now looking back, you almost said it a second ago. I want to go further in that to link things together. You said your father was, because I grew up in a strict, just gotta work, gotta get education, gotta get education. Sometimes some of that's cultural, some of that is cultural. You're a brown person in the world, you gotta work twice as hard to get half as much, right? That's what you kind of taught. Back in the day, at least. I mean, it's a little different now, but back in the day. Do you think though, now that you went through all your schooling and stuff, like you said, did it actually really help then in a certain way?
Yes and no. So I'd say two things about that. Firstly, I didn't have to, the volume and the time that I was pressured to study was completely unnecessary, and I know that because I used to play my Game Boy for at least half of it. So I used to literally have it in my drawer when my dad left. I would sit there and play for honestly for half of the time that I was supposed to be studying because I wasn't allowed out. I could hear other kids playing outside. It was pretty sad at times. And then when I heard his footsteps, I put the Game Boy back. So I know that I did about half of what he thought that I did, and I still got straight A's, still got into medical school. So that's one thing. The other thing is this is really bizarre, but the work ethic was kind of sewed into me, and then it was dormant for a long period of time, and then eventually later on in my life it came back out. So to be specific, when I went to uni when I was 18 years old, I went to Edinburgh. That's when I used to live in Scotland. So that's a good parents live near Manchester, so it's a good 4 or 5 hour drive. So it's quite far away. And I wanted to get as much independence as possible. I just kind of went off the rails a little bit. Studied the minimum amount. I was very, very lazy. I basically just didn't. I think I hadn't had enough of studying, so I kind of rebelled against it. And my lifestyle was very, very lazy, I'd say. And the weird thing is that years and years later, maybe in my early 30s, I had to sit these exams to get through my qualifications as a junior doctor to become a middle grade psychiatrist. And something completely unexpectedly snapped back into me. And I was doing what my dad used to make me do, which I used to resent, which was getting up at 6 a.m, studying loads. It was like a revelation. I could fit so much more into my day if I wanted to. If I didn't come home and watch crap TV, if I didn't go to if I went to the pub 2 times a week instead of every single day with my friends, then there's just so much more time that I could have in my life. And I think my father gave that to me, but it just took me decades to actually understand how valuable it was.
So have you told your father that or no?
No, we remember things very differently.
Watch it now, Dad. Watch it. That's so funny. I love it. And see that's also going to inform you how you treat your kids too. Because it's funny how we're brought up. Either we fall in line or we do something totally opposite. Like we're the opposite. So that goes back to your other thing about being silly and stuff. There's got to get something in there. I love that. For me, I had family in the medical profession, so I kind of followed. I was like, yeah, I want to do this. I didn't want to be a doctor. I want to be a nurse, or something in the profession. When did the medical field hit you, come into your orbit that you want to do it?
I've got to be perfectly honest with you, James. I went into medicine for the wrong reasons. So I went in because I was clever enough to get the grades, and because my parents wanted me to do medicine. They wanted it for the right reasons, for the stability and the job stability, the job satisfaction and everything, and being a pillar to society. The honest truth is I was 18 when I went to medical school, and I couldn't care less. All I wanted to do was get away from my parents so I could go out and party. And I did that for about 5 or 6 years. Well, actually longer than that, but I did it for the time that I was in Edinburgh. And I didn't take it very seriously, is the honest truth. Until I found psychiatry. That's the first placement that I did where I actually cared about, I actually clicked with the patients. So I think just stepping into there, sometimes very, very bizarre delusional world with people with psychosis, or meeting people after the lowest ebb after suicide attempts. That's something else that I do as a medical student. And it just suddenly dawned on me that actually all the things that I'm doing are not important really, whereas people actually have real problems, and I can actually help. And so that was probably my fifth year of medical school. So I was 21, 22 at the time. And I was like, actually, I can make a difference. And this is a privilege to be in this situation. I shouldn't just waste it.
Yes, folks, he's an overachiever. Yes, he Mr. Doss here, like Dr. Doss here, like, I mean, 21 in medical school. I'm like, hello, that's crazy. I do want to ask, because people have asked me the same question. I told you on my show. Because you said you're a psychiatrist, so you can prescribe medications. You're a doctor. You're literally a doctor. You can do that kind of, like, not MD doctor, but you're a doctor, correct?
Yeah, that's right. You call it MD in the States, but we call it MBCHB out here. But yeah, full doctor. Yeah.
That was another question. We were like, what's between the psychologist and this? I'm like, some can't prescribe, some can. I want to show you're actually you're a medical doctor.
Yeah. And the other thing that psychiatrists can do that psychiatrists can't, the psychologists can't, is section people. So detain them, commit them. Is that what you say in the States? Yeah. So I have that power.
Well, you guys call them in the UK, call them section them?
Yeah, section them under the Mental Health Act. Yeah.
I kind of like that word a little bit, commit. I like section. They're very different. I love it. Okay, so but forensic, so where the forensic, how did that part come into? So you're already doing psychiatry, you're studying it. Where did that, because your studies, you kind of naturally led that direction?
Yeah. So when you're doing your training, you get to do 6 month placements, and there's lots of different subspecialties of psychiatry. There's like, alcohol and drugs, old age psychiatry, liaison psychiatry, which is post-suicide attempts mostly. And one of them is forensic psychiatry. And I'd always sort of heard this term, but I didn't really know what it was all about, because the wards are reserved for the riskiest patient. There's not that many of those kinds of wards, right? So there's only like one forensic ward to something like 15 or 16 general adult wards, and they're only very small niche hospitals. So because of that, there's not many placements. And I have to say, I did it almost on a whim, and it was my very last placement before I had to choose which subspecialty to specialize in. And I didn't particularly think I'd be into it, and I kind of just did it more out of curiosity than anything. And I was just fascinated from day one. So I think I was working on a medium secure unit with 14 males, and half of them, probably more than half, had actually killed somebody at some point. And I was absolutely fascinated by their backstories, because you get to know them so personally. They're in hospital for sometimes many, many years, and you meet their parents, you meet them, you sit and speak with them on a couple of times a week over the space of years. You have all of their medical records, school records. So you really get to piece together their journey of what led them down the path of mental illness and violence as well. So it's the backstory that drew me in.
A question that I get sometimes when I'm out and about off work, how do you turn it off? I tell all the time. So when I go out and about, I'll just interview people when I'm out at a club or something. Like, hi, so what do you do? I don't do all that. I know how to turn it off. Like, so for you, or can you always assess people when you, like a media assessment, not judge, but assess people when you meet them? Like, you met me. So like, you think, oh, do you automatically, you're already looking for, like, do you automatically do that, or do you how does that work?
I'm making notes on you right now, James.
I'm psychotic, sure. I'm sure I am. Yeah, so I guess,
yeah. So no, I don't think I analyze people generally when I meet them. I think so. Firstly, I'd say is that what I'm looking for is generally very severe mental illness. It is, people hearing voices, or it is people with paranoid delusions or grandiose thinking or extreme narcissists. So just by the nature of the work that I do, it's the extreme end of mental illness. So just because of that fact by itself, it means that most people that I meet, the vast majority, won't have those kind of issues. So for that in itself means that I'm not really picking it up. I do think I probably form an opinion on most people that I meet or speak to. Like, say, if I'm at a party with my wife, we'd come home and speak about it. But I think everyone does that. I think the only difference is I know the terminology to fit it into a category of potential personality disorder or personality traits. I've just got the language. I don't think I'm any more analytic than the average person, I think.
That makes sense. Good. You say, that person's a narcissist, and I probably could say the same thing. I mean, you might know for sure they are. I may think they
Yeah.
are. You may like they are. No, I was like, no, no, no.
Or
Like,
like say yeah, like you might walk away and think that person's full of themselves, or that person like he was really misinterpreting my questions, whereas I might say narcissistic personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder. But what I'm doing is saying the same thing, but making it sound cleverer than it actually is, you know.
yes, it must be interesting for your wife to be married to you. It must be very interesting on that front of like what you do for a living, what you're taught. I think anybody who dates doctors, psychologists, any of that kind of stuff, it's a very interesting profession to be married to, I'm sure.
Well, she's a A-level psychology teacher herself, so she teaches at high school, but she
Oh, there you
knows,
go.
you know, a lot of the background. The one difference between us is that she completely opposite to me. She gets emotionally affected by hearing about other people suffering and violence. So I will sometimes I've stopped doing it now because she doesn't like it, but at the beginning of our relationship I would tell her about, just because I was genuinely interested, like I saw this case where this person did this and the victim was a child, and it's weird because I'm closer to it because I meet the perpetrator and occasionally I meet the victim as well, depending on the circumstances. And I don't really, as I was saying before, I'm able to separate myself like you. I can compartmentalize the emotions, so I don't feel, I mean, I'm not saying I don't feel any emotions, but I don't feel too shaken up by it. Whereas if I tell my wife about it, even though she's never met them, she is more kind of upset about the whole thing than I am.
That's so funny. I love that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about you get some hot takes from you, from some things that are out there. There's some topics that have come up from myself and others that are just they're curious, and we're going to see what you think about them. So, folks, get ready for this. One of the things that we all want to know about is psychopaths and sociopaths. You've talked about this. He's on TikTok, folks. He's on TikTok. On there. But you talk about stuff like this, and it's got a lot of attention for you. I'm just curious, briefly on here, what is the difference?
Sure. So a psychopath is a clinical term. It's something that I diagnose as a forensic psychiatrist, whereas a sociopath is more of an informal term. So what I mean is that if you asked 100 forensic psychiatrists what a psychopath is, they'd all say pretty much the same thing. Whereas if you asked 100 sociologists what a sociopath is, they might say slightly different things. It's not as well defined, is what I'm saying. Having said all that, the differences are that a psychopath is much more deceitful and sneaky and is able to kind of blend into society. So both of them lack empathy. Both of them will tear your heart out or stab you in the back. They're both quite charming and manipulative. But I think a psychopath is able to hide all of that. They're able to come across as normal. So you don't know a psychopath is a psychopath probably the first few times you meet them. Whereas a sociopath has all of those things, but is more kind of reactive. So if you annoy or piss off a sociopath, he will get angry on the spot. Whereas if you do that to a psychopath, he will plan his revenge much more craftily.
Yes. Also, he and I were talking about this off camera. There was he read something I wrote to him, and we were laughing about this. But to me, both actually apply to this. The slap. Now, some folks say the slap refer to the Will Smith Chris Rock slap. Others refer to the TV show. There were two TV shows, one in Australia and one in America, which I've seen, and I've seen the parody, which is it's going around. It's really hilarious, the parody of it, where this guy just slaps everybody, the cops, everybody slaps everybody, it's funny. But slapping, that's something big anyway. That's a major hit someone across the face. Maybe you think so. I want to get your hot takes on either one of them. We had a good laugh off camera about this, but like, what are some of your takes on that? On those?
Were you slapped? Do you mind me asking, by your parents growing up?
Yes.
Were you disciplined? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Me
No,
too.
we had corporal punishment at school. So my
really?
parents,
Wow.
No, I'll come there and slap him. Like I'll spank him or whatever. I got spankings, whippings. I mean, we got it growing up. This is the 70s. So I did.
Yeah. Me too. So I was hit by my parents. And it's weird because I don't think I ever really thought about it, but I assumed when I was younger, before I had kids, that I probably would slap my kids just because it happened to me. And it's not, my parents didn't abuse me and I wouldn't abuse my kids, obviously, but I just thought it was a normal way that you would discipline a kid just because what I was used to. But then when I met my wife, she'd convinced me, before we had kids, that there's no need to. And that if you do that, apart from exceptional circumstances, in most normal circumstances, then that's a failure. You failed somewhere to let it escalate to that kind of degree. And I think she's right, actually, I have to say. Again, I said there are exceptional circumstances. I think if a kid's like just completely out of control and is violent, then you've got your duty to protect other people, yourself included. I would never slap my kids. And yeah, I've definitely, I think most adults have been in situations where, not now because they're 8 and 10, but when they were 2 and 4, 4 and 6, where it just drives you insane, like the amount of time and effort you can put into something and they just don't listen to you. And yeah, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But I don't think it's necessary. If you put boundaries in early on and you stick to them for a longer period of time. And it's harder. It's much, much, much harder to do that consistently than it is to let shit slide and then slap a kid when they're a bit older.
I will before you go on. I'm going to admit this. So, folks out there at home, it's a long time. My kids are grown, so I did spank my daughter once. It was back in the '90s. She was a kid. She was like 2 years old, 3 years old, and she was being a hellion. Just a hellion. And I only did it one time. And I didn't like it. I found afterwards, but I understood how I got there. That makes any sense. I understood how angry I was, how tired I was. When you have small children, those first couple of years, you're tired all the time. And I'm working, and we're going to school, and it was a bunch of things came together, and to that point of that incident. And I liked what I felt afterwards because I was spanked. And I didn't like it. Like you, I just figured that's part of life also on some level. But I did it once, and I never did it again. I have a deep voice, so my kids get scared of me a lot of times. I a deep voice and they stop. But you're right. You have to find other ways that can be severe but not abusive. But I just want to say that I did hit my child once. I did.
And can I ask you, did that change anything afterwards? Like, did it change the dynamics, or did it make her like scared of you, or make her like more easily pliable?
I think she was more. I mean, she's and we're very close to this day. It made her look at me a little differently. It did. I noticed for the first, I would say the first like 3 or 4 months after that, we weren't as close. There was a little, because we were very close. I mean, baby, we just bonded very quickly. And her mother and I were working, going to school. So we equally took care of her, I did notice a little difference those first months. But I feel like I regained her trust again. But she never, since then, and she's 35 years old, has never talked to me the way she did at that. I think you have to ask her on her end, but I think on some level, I felt there was a little bit of a hesitation for her to come to me sometimes for those first 3 or 4 months after that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do remember, even though it's a very, very long time ago, I do remember like a time of fearing my dad for a day or two afterwards every time he hit me. Yeah,
we all got spanked. I mean, when I was growing up, everybody got spanked, so it was like we didn't like it. But it was almost comical, but it wasn't, because we were like, well, he's gonna whip my ass when I get home if he can. Like we all knew it. We all knew it. So it's kind of this weird thing. But now to look back on, I'm like, no, that was abuse. I mean, so that was not, but then I'm Gen X, and we feel like we survived everything. Like we survived being alone. We survived no seatbelts. I mean, we smoked in the house. I mean, I guess so we survived everything. So it's
it probably sounds kind of crazy to people who are like young people under 20 to hear anything like this, but it is what you're used to, isn't it? So, talking about my dad specifically, his parents slapped him and all of his siblings, everybody around him. It was just part of what you did. It wasn't even, people wouldn't question it,
Now, you and I both read the Will Smith book, right? You read it too, right?
Yeah.
So I read it before. I read it before this. The other slap happened. What else? Because I was sitting there watching it live. I watched the Oscars, and I'm in the entertainment industry, so I'm going to write about I'm sitting there, and that happens.
Yeah.
What are some of your thoughts about that whole situation?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So by a coincidence, I literally just finished reading was listening to it on audiobook, his autobiography, about a week before the infamous slap. And I think there's so many things from his earlier childhood that I think are connected. And obviously I kind of do this kind of assessment for a living. So firstly, if you remember, he had a very complicated relationship with his father, who he called Daddy-O. He said his father was a drunk and was quite abusive, but was also quite supportive and loving towards Will Smith. So it's all very kind of warped, I suppose, tangled. and his father was physically abusive towards his mother, and Will would try and de-escalate the situation by being like this joker and this jovial person, whereas his brother, who's 5 years younger, would physically take a beating to protect their mother. So Will always felt like a massive coward because of that, and I think his brother even made some comments when they were growing up. So that's one thing. He was always seen as a soft rapper, I think is fair to say, compared to other rappers. You know, he didn't perpetuate stereotype, wasn't a gangster, didn't swear.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And there were others around the same time. You know, I used to listen to a Tribe Called Quest De La Soul. So I don't think all rappers around that period were, gangsters. They weren't all sort of Wu-Tang and Snoop Dogg, but there was something different. There's something. I'm going to say corny, even though I like him as a character. I think he was a bit corny. I think he was seen as corny. So I'm saying all of this because I think that he's got this kind of paranoia and a chip on his shoulder about being seen as being a bit soft by female people in his family and by other rappers. So I think he's got that in his core. That's one of his core kind of insecurities, and I think that's really relevant to why he ended up slapping Chris Rock. But even on top of that, I can't remember whether we talked about this the other day, but on the 2016 there was a joke that Chris Rock made about him boycotting the Oscars, about Will Smith and Jada boycotting the Oscars. And basically they were trying to prove a political point, which is there wasn't enough black representation in the Oscars. And I think he, knowingly or unknowingly, Chris Rock kind of diminished the seriousness of what they were trying to do by saying his joke. What was it? Something like, Jada boycotting the Oscars is like me boycotting Rihanna's panty. I wasn't invited. And he didn't make fun of any other celebrity during that speech. So it wasn't like he was roasting loads of people and he picked, Will was one of them. It was almost felt targeted. So I think him slapping Chris Rock was not actually about what Chris Rock had said on that evening. I think it was all of those other insecurities and paranoias subconsciously that were kind of brewing underneath, plus what Chris Rock had said a couple of years earlier. And I think he was ready, he was primed to be offended. And so as soon as it happened, it was like this trigger went off and it just happened.
And it's just so weird that he won the Oscar like a few minutes later. I think it was such a bizarre evening. It was bizarre.
Can I ask you a question, James? What do you think about not the incident itself, but the way that people have reacted to Will? Like, do you think people have forgiven him? Do you think he will be forgiven? What's your kind of take on his comeback?
That's a good question. And my thing is, so he and I are the same age. We basically grew up together, so to speak. I don't know him personally, I mean, we grew up together. I'm a black man in America also. I know what that feels like. I'm in the entertainment world, just like I understand that stuff. There's always we're always fighting the narrative, and you probably understand this too as a brown person, of trying to be the good brown person, the good black guy. And that was his thing. He was a true box office star. And he's black, but he's a true international box office star. And I say, and I guess in music too, he has some big hits, obviously. But you're right, he wasn't revealed. He had the street cred. That's what it is. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
You touched on him. He didn't have the street cred of a Tribe Called Quest or a De La Soul, or who didn't cuss either, or Queen Latifah. Yeah. They didn't cuss either. But for some reason, they're okay and they're very revered. But for him, it's like parents were starting to understand. Great songs and everything, but they didn't respect him as well. Wild Wild West and all stuff. They didn't expect him as much. But also people in America especially, like to build someone up. And they want to see the fall so bad. It's this weird thing. I don't. It's like maybe it's Schadenfreude. I guess it is something. They just want to see them fall, and it's like someone say, "Ha ha, you're not invincible." Yet we built you that way because we watched all your movies, made them billions. I mean, it's a phenomenon that I don't understand fully, and I'm 54 years old. I still understand it. So when the slap happened, people taking sides, and one of the big sides was. Good. So now Will's and all that. See, Will's and all that. He's all right. And then the white folks in America are like, see, black on black crime, so to speak. And it was like, oh, there we go. They're invited to the big party, which is the Oscars. That's the big party. Then there was this other half. It was like, but Will, who like us, who read this book, but Will is a regular person. There's some issues that are in there. We need to forgive him, but we'll see what he says. Like we're waiting to see how that. So there was split. And for me, I just was in shock. I was just really in shock, but I never put Will on a pedestal in the first place. I admired him. I like some of his movies. I got him, but almost probably thought it's kind of good because we don't want these deities up there that we keep doing all the time where they can't do anything. And I was kind of like, I just want to see how he responds. He did a couple of movies and got critical acclaim and taken one didn't do so well, whatever. I feel like he probably could come back. It's going to take some time. You got to lay low, do
Yeah.
some guest parts. I feel like I can map out his career. I'm going to be able to do all that. But I feel like America does like a comeback story too. You know,
Yeah.
Mel Gibson came back. I mean, it's really came. I mean, if he can come back, I mean, I just think that because he didn't, because Will slapped someone. He didn't like do any horrific, heinous thing.
Yeah.
So I think so I think, and personally myself, I think he can come back. To what degree, I'm not sure. Because again, Americans are fickle. They do like a comeback story. They do. And if you do the apology tour correctly and have the right vehicle to promote, anything's possible.
Yeah.
Sense? That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely just I hate to see anybody. It's just me. Anybody brown go down. I hate that. I mean, but I know we're all human. I mean, that's the whole thing that everyone is human. I've made mistakes on television. I said things I probably shouldn't have said here and there. I mean, we all do. It's just kind of like you're in a public forum and it's 24/7. It just happens. The
Yeah.
last one I want to talk to you, I can talk to you all day long, but the last one I want to talk to you about another figure that I'm kind of fascinated by myself because I'm watching all of his stuff, and that's
Yeah.
Andrew Tate. And
Yeah.
I mean, he's in the news all the time, and for his exploits, especially in Europe right now. Okay, what's
Yeah.
going on there? And I listen to him talk and stuff, but I want to hear what your thoughts are on Mr. Tate.
Sure. So one of the kind of most fascinating aspects to me is why he's so popular. And I've actually done a video on this on my YouTube channel, Psych for Soul Minds. And I think there's a number of reasons. I think that he is an icon for this disenfranchised group of young men, mostly white privileged men, because there's this kind of woke movement, rightly so, when people are calling people out for misogynistic behavior. And because that's happening so much, it's kind of snowballed over the last few years. I think that some people feel that their privilege is being taken away. And I think Andrew Tate is a perfect kind of image, and he's a symbol of of representing them. He's also sort of hyper masculine, which really plays into that kind of person. So somebody that's got toxic masculinity. So specifically, don't show your emotions. Everything's a competition. Homophobia, misogyny, making fun of everything, not trying to understand anything really that doesn't fit your ideology, and kind of mocking it. So I think it really, all of that plays into this rebellion, and that's what I think it is. I think some teenagers are into him because they just like to rebel against the trend. And if the trend nowadays is anti-woke, then that's what you rebel against. Just like, hip hop, rock music, all of these things were the perfect antithesis of what society was at that time. Andrew Tate is the perfect antithesis of what some of society is like now. So I think it's a combination of all of these things. But I also think it's his own kind of credibility. I'm using that word sort of very loosely, but from the perspective of his fans, he's got swagger. He's not some disgusting fat man. He's I don't know if I call him good looking, but he's certainly in toned in shape. He's got the tattoos. He looks cool to some, I would say. He has this rags to riches story. So he grew up in poverty, then became a multimillionaire, doing something that would be like a wet dream for most teenage boys. So you don't have to have any sort of qualifications or hard work. You're just a social media star, and you can just say what you think about anything, and you get paid. That's what it's seemingly you get paid millions of dollars for that. Obviously, it's all a house of cards for everybody else. And I suppose he's quite good at making his points, even though I don't agree with almost everything he says. He's good at arguing his corner. Like he can take crap and give it back. I think he's quite he's what's the word, eloquent in the way that he speaks. And he says stuff that's sort of short and pithy, which is perfect for social media. I think he's very clever on social media. He doesn't go on sort of rambling speeches. He says things that, I wouldn't call them funny, but I suppose at stretch you can call them witty. He has these little sort of one-liners or two-liners that can be quite sexist, but can be quite funny as well, I suppose. And they spread like wildfire. And what really kind of indicates that to me, or highlights that to me, is that even when he was banned on various platforms, when he was banned on Facebook, he still had millions and millions of views because his fans would retweet or repost what he was saying and doing. So it's almost like if you cut off his head, like it's almost like 10 of his followers will grow in his place.
Yes, I know he was somebody I didn't know who he was, and all of a sudden he was everywhere. And you're
Yeah.
right, his fan base, and I'm noticing it. I'm noticing all the mini Andrew Tates that are coming up now. That this whole bring back male, this bring back masculinity, I mean, all these whatever terms they want to use. But you're right, Andrew Tate was but he's the one who seems to get international news. Like he's the one who I guess got arrested in some country.
Yeah.
That's something. But I was just like, who is this guy? I'm like you said, he's cool looking to a lot of people, I think, to men and to
Yeah.
women who might like him, but to men who are like, oh, he's kind of cool. I got like shaved head, also like they want to go out. And you're right, he does say things that that if you didn't have a brain would sound smart, or sound like, yeah, you're right. I feel the same way. That's why. So he's very deliberate. You're right in what he says. So it must be for your background, following him must be a trip.
Yeah, and I think I'm probably one very small part of the problem. I think there's a lot of people like myself who are a bit voyeuristic. So we don't support anything he says, but you just want to know what he's going to do next because it is provocative. You want to see how people
Yeah,
react. It's almost like a soap opera, isn't it? So I think that's part of the problem actually, because YouTube and Twitter and Instagram don't care about whether people are watching him ironically. They just care about how many views he gets. So if
mm-hmm.
there are enough people on both sides who support
Right.
him and who hate him, but pay him attention, then it kind of feeds the algorithm to have him become more famous, makes him more money, and he can continue his lifestyle. Not now, obviously, because he's behind bars, but actually he's on house arrest, I believe. But
House arrest, yes,
before all of this happened, yeah.
All publicity is good publicity. They always say in the old days. As long as they're talking about you, as they always say all the time in Hollywood. As long as they're talking about you. Dr. Doss, you're amazing. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. You're an amazing interviewer, James. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome back anytime. But first, tell the folks where they can find you. I'll put it in the description below, of course. But I want you to tell people, and because this is also high audio podcast listeners, where they can find you.
Sure. So my main kind of efforts go into my YouTube channel, which is called A Psych for Sore Minds. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that. I have somebody else repost most of my stuff because I'm too old and feeble to do it myself. But I do all my YouTube stuff myself. And I've got a book called Into Minds: Stories of Murder, Justice, and Recovery from a Forensic Psychiatrist. So that's just kind of outlining my most extreme and tragic and gruesome cases.
Yes. Follow him now. Follow him now. Tell him James sent you. I'm James Lott Jr. And you can follow me. We're all James Lott Jr. is sold at James Lott Jr. on all social media platforms, JLJ Media on all social media platforms, and the granddaddy of them all, my YouTube channel, JLJ Media, where I have over 50 different types of shows you can choose from. And this one too. So share this with anybody you think needs to hear this interview. Please do that. Everyone, take care and we'll see you next time.